I get a lot of messages from Christians telling me, hey, I recognize what you're saying about Paul being a false apostle and teaching a different gospel message than Jesus is true, but how do I talk about this with other Christians? Because everybody is so indoctrinated and emotionally invested in believing that every word of Paul's letters is true. And so here's how I approach the subject, and I think it's very effective. I start with this question. Does it make sense to you that Jesus handpicked 12 apostles who walked with him for years and he taught them all of his ways, but somehow none of them quite got the message right? So Jesus had to appear after his death to a man whose entire job was to murder Jesus' followers and give him the real reason that Jesus came to earth, which was simply to die for our sins as a blood atonement sacrifice, and this is how we get to heaven, something he never actually taught any of his own apostles. So that gets people thinking, because it doesn't make sense, and they will usually ask then, well, but I thought Paul's gospel does line up with what Jesus taught. So then I point out, well, if Jesus' entire mission of coming to earth was to die as a blood atonement sacrifice for our sins, and believing that means the difference between you going to heaven and spending eternity in hell, don't you think Jesus would have spent some time teaching his disciples about that? But there's not a single teaching from Jesus that says that. So that gets people racking their brains, and if they have actually carefully read the Gospels, they will usually point out, well, but at the Last Supper, Jesus said, this is the cup, my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins of many. The different Gospels have different ways of saying it. And I point out, okay, yeah, it does say that, and there is actually a problem with that, which I'll get to. But first, does it, again, if that was Jesus' entire mission, why would he only mention it one single time at the Last Supper and not really expand on it at all? Does that make sense? So if they're an open-minded person and they agree with that, because it makes sense, I'll point out that the only source that we have for Jesus even saying that at the Last Supper is Paul's letters. Paul admits in 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 26, that he got that entire communion doctrine directly from Jesus. The Gospels were all written by Pauline authors after Paul's letters, and there's no other historical source for Jesus actually saying that. Since this saying contradicts everything else Jesus taught on salvation, it's likely this was a theological insertion and not something Jesus said.